From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters.
Bouncing around, Mata to cut it back again, and Rashford has got the dream goal that he was looking for in his debut, and one he will never, ever forget.
Marcus Rashford is 23 years old, a football player for Manchester United, one of the biggest names in the world of sports. On the football pitch, he's got it all. Speed, precision, a magic wand of a right foot.
Rashfords! And that's what it means to a Mancunian in red.
But it's what he's doing off the field that's capturing the attention, the admiration, and the support of millions. In the summer, nearly 2 million school kids in the UK who qualify for government-subsidized meals would go hungry because of school shutdowns during the pandemic, and an untold number of families face financial hardship.
What families are going through now, I once had to go through that same system, and it's very difficult to find a way out.
Rashford teamed up with a charity, food banks, and businesses to fill in the gaps, doing what the British government would not. Then, because of public pressure, Boris Johnson's government reversed their policy. Then, Rashford did it again this November, forcing the government to extend school meal programs for the rest of this year and next year. Today, we're talking to Shireen Ahmed, writer, sports activist, and co-host of the Burn It All Down podcast. We'll talk about Marcus Rashford, how he's part of something bigger, a new generation of athletes who won't shut up and dribble, and why their voices are playing a big role in this moment of social change. Shireen, it's good to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So off the top, I wanted our listeners to know that between you and I, there's a big difference of opinion when it comes to the allegiance of football clubs. Shireen, you are a Gunner, a supporter of Arsenal FC. I am a dyed-in-the-wool Manchester United fan. Some people listening probably have no idea what I'm talking about, but trust me, there is a big rivalry here, right?
Definitely. And I mean, Adrian, I think you're smart. And, we'll work through your Man U tendencies. It's okay. It's fine.
Right. It's hard to go back now. It's a religion, right?
Right.
But we are putting all of that aside today to talk about something that's bigger than football, and that's the work that Marcus Rashford is doing in the UK. So I quickly wanted to recap this work and the campaign. What is the campaign exactly?
So essentially what was happening is that state-funded food programs for children in schools that were being offered for lower income kids was being cut by Boris Johnson and that government. And what was happening was that there was an outcry, but like just so many outcries before, about those social issues and needs of, poor communities. The missives went unheard. And what Marcus Rashford did, and his story, for those who don't know him, was raised by a single mom in the UK, and he actually ate from that program. Like, he used that program as a youth.
She done the best she could within the circumstances. I understand that it could have went either way for me, and I'm grateful that it went this way for me. But it doesn't make me forget about what happened in the past, and I obviously want to help them people and as much as I can.
And he was moved to start talking about it. Now, one of the things about Manchester United is probably, if not the most lucrative football team in the world. It has a machine of its supporters. Now, Marcus Rashford, being who he is on that squad, was essentially saying, this is important. And what happens is money and fans and the whole system are driven by that engagement. And they got involved. And his talking had other people talking. And then local MPs started jumping on it that are in favor of this program to continue. So what ended up happening was the government was forced to make a U-turn. Because if one of their arguably most famous footballers in the country, who is what they call homegrown, and that's a term used in English football frequently for those that have risen through the ranks within the English system, as opposed to players that play abroad and go and join the Premier League. So he was like a homegrown lad, and he had used it and spoke to the importance it had, and kind of like, well, look at me now, I worked hard and I had this helped me. So that ended up shifting. And from there, Marcus Rashford started to find out about food sustainability and food bank programs. And like many wonderful things, when athletes realize a platform and use their agency, it's propelled into something that I think is beautiful and important.
And it's forced the Johnson government to make a U-turn on that funding of the free school meals program, not once, but twice now.
Yes, exactly. And I don't know if I would necessarily call this a win. I mean, I think the struggle is ongoing for people that live there. It's not as if issues of classism and racism that exist within poverty have been resolved. But what this means that a whole bunch of kids will get food and will get food that they need to be successful. We know the relationship between foods and healthy brains and healthy minds, and this will help undoubtedly.
And an update this week, too. Not only is he taking the school meals program so personally, he's also starting a children's book club to boost literacy rates in the UK. Like, he seemingly can do no wrong right now. And these issues are objectively important things in society.
Yeah, one of the things I really love about this is that we see the growth of athlete activists. And I don't necessarily think that Marcus Rashford, like so many, sort of wanted to be an activist in this sphere, but realizing what's happening. And the education piece doesn't fall far away from the anti-racism and the anti-oppression and anti-poverty campaigns. All those struggles are connected. And we know this. Doing the anti-oppression work, we know this. So he's realizing, and it's going to snowball into other wonderful things, and the impact that he's had on children who consider him a hero, not just on the pitch, but off the pitch, has been moving. And I mean, this is hard for me. I'm not a Manchester United fan. This is hard for me to say, but I can't help but love what's happening and the way he's speaking so authentically and so sincerely. And people are being moved because you can't dismantle his lived experience. And this is somebody saying, I went through that, and this is why it's important.
Yeah. We know that football and sports can be so tribal, and obviously we're seeing that in politics too. But at least among the general public and many small businesses in the UK, we've seen how they've responded, that it's gotten widespread support, no matter if somebody supports a different club or what have you. It's gone beyond that. So many people in the UK, and it's become a huge story there, that they're getting behind it and they're supporting where government originally had not.
Absolutely. And a perfect example of that tribalism of which you speak would be to look at Raheem Sterling, who is at, arguably Manchester United's rival team, Manchester City. And those are two people in that space that have been doing a lot. I mean, Raheem Sterling speaks very much about anti-racism and speaks about systems within that. And, those two things. And we're seeing that we know that there's issues that are more pressing than, the tactical press on the field. We know this. There's issues that are more important and are interwoven into sport. And I don't expect this from athletes. I don't want to push the pressure on racialized athletes, like BIPOC athletes, having to carry the burden of anti-racism. And we know that. As two racialized people, you and I know that the notion of dismantling systems of racism falls on the most marginalized. So I don't ever expect an athlete to do it. But when they do, and what they give, and the emotional labor, psychological labor, and often financial labor that's involved with that is a lot. But to see it being done is marvelous.
We'll be right back. And I think it's important to point out, too, that this is not easy work. This is not simple work, because there has been a cost for Marcus Rashford and other athletes like him who have spoken out. It's not all positive. Certainly since the Boris Johnson government has made those policy U-turns, Marcus Rashford has been the target of Conservative MPs on Twitter who question his motivation. They question his understanding of the issues.
When Marcus Rashford urged people this morning to think about families who couldn't have a hot shower, one cabinet minister sounded unsympathetic, replying that water can't be disconnected.
Now parts of the media, too, are doing the same. And I wanted to talk about that controversial story in the Daily Mail, of course, a British tabloid. Can you explain what that Daily Mail story was?
Essentially, the Daily Mail was going after Marcus Rashford because he had purchased some property and what's known as luxury homes. And we know that real estate is extremely and excruciatingly expensive in the UK and in most major cities. But they were questioning his ability to be sincere in his work. It's this incredibly classist idea that if you are doing some type of activist work, you need to be poor, because otherwise you're disingenuous. And I find that very bizarre. So they were questioning him and sort of attacking his credibility, I guess you could say. And I mean, this is the Daily Mail, first of all. Like, let's just be very real about the type of reporting that they do. And they have a history of this. They have a history of going after Raheem Sterling. This is a young man that bought property for his mother because they grew up in a poor community. And he was criticized for that. He bought a car. He was criticized for that. But nobody will go back and, let's just say, question, Jamie Vardy's purchases, who's a player on a different team, but he's white. So, it's not just an argument about what is this person investing in. It's clearly about race, because the way that they're targeting these people, saying, well, why is he buying this? Why is Marcus Rashford buying a flashy car? And I mean, to be quite honest, we exist in a capitalist space. Marcus Rashford wants to invest in real estate. I think that's some excellent advice he's been getting, and he should. And that doesn't mean that if he invests in this property, he can't reinvest other things into the community. Like, they're not mutually exclusive. He can do all of it. And I think he should. Like, I'm very much of the opinion that get that cash money, do it.
Right, yeah. And, let's call this reporting what it is. It's a dog whistle. It's saying, let's focus on this athlete and the way they spend their money. And maybe that would insinuate that they're disingenuous about the actual work that they're doing.
Yeah, and I mean, numbers don't lie. Like, how is Marcus Rashford? We're not going to talk about the Premier League table because I'm an Arsenal fan and embarrassed, and we're not going to talk about that. But if we look at the standings, how are they doing as a team? They're doing well. And Marcus Rashford and Raheem Sterling are performing well. And critics can't attack them on that basis. So they're going for menial and vacuous attacks on them. So I never thought I'd want Man U to do well, but I'm kind of rooting for this guy and rooting for the team. So, I mean, there's something about that that's really special.
Listen, in COVID times, if we can ease some of the tension, that's not a bad thing. What do you think Marcus Rashford's campaigning and the way it's being covered by some members of the media, the way it's talked about on Twitter and online? What do you think it tells us about racism and classism and the way we talk about that in sports?
Well, I mean, I'm part of sports media. I'm a critic of how the narratives are spun. But what I do really love is that, people like Ian Wright, who is like a great in the football world, people are talking about how important that work is and giving them the dues where they deserve. And, there's Alex Scott, who's a commentator. She was with Arsenal women's side and in English National. She commented on that. And I think that's really important, is when other athletes are also talking about the importance of this campaign and signing on to it. And tribalism that you mentioned aside, the campaign, whether it's, empowerment of youth, it's anti-oppression, it's anti-racism campaigns, all this stuff is so important because this is exactly where the talk about sports is right now. And if we look at the numbers and the demographics of who's in this type of media in the UK, that would also be quite telling, like from which lens are people writing. And as someone who writes frequently for British sports media, I know what the demographics are, and they're very similar to Canada, where this industry is almost 90% white, able-bodied, cis-het men. And that's the lens. And are they looking from a nuanced lens? Not necessarily all the time. So we have to, when we look at it, we interrogate it. These are all the pieces that have to be included.
Right, exactly. And it's through a very specific kind of perspective that sports is being talked about and who is allowed to talk about certain things.
Exactly. And, I think that in this discussion of Rashford, are we going to disclude or exclude youth workers? Are we going to discount social workers and educators that are speaking, public health officials, child youth workers that are talking about how important this is? You have teachers that are tearing up because Marcus Rashford is telling kids to read a book. Guess what? The kids are going to read a book. And some of the critiques I've seen have been very shallow from opposing MPs of, well, why don't their parents just teach to them? Well, if their parents are working 3 jobs to try to stay afloat, we all wish we could have story time with our children with hot cocoa, don't we? But that's not always the reality for a lot of kids and a lot of racialized kids too. So I'm happy that there's gaps being filled in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this conversation, I think, speaks to our moment in 2020, because if there's a phrase that gets at the debate about politics and sports right now, in the year 2020, it can almost be summed up in right-wing commentator Laura Ingraham telling NBA star LeBron James to shut up and dribble.
So keep the political commentary to yourself, or as someone once said, shut up and dribble.
Right, that was a famous clip, particularly when it came to sharing his view on politics. And that phrase now has, by many athletes, it's been repurposed, who are refusing to do that. How do you see that conversation changing and how athletes are speaking truth to power?
I think that the whole thing about politics being polarizing is an antiquated notion. I mean, my identity has always been woven into the way that I view something. And this whole idea of sports aren't political, they've always been. I have never ever heard a racialized, a disabled, or a queer community athlete tell me sports aren't political. They only are. The only people that ever say that are gatekeepers or people who have nothing to lose, the most powerful. So who are we asking that sports aren't political? Who is making that demand? The people that do not want to be inconvenienced. And this isn't about politics. This is about identity and lived experience. I mean, you gave me an idea. I'm going to step away from saying sports shouldn't be political, meaning that sports are about identity and are about life. And the athletes doing this know that and are talking about their lives and talking about the impact that these things are having on their lives and sharing. And they don't have media training in most cases. They're protected by PR at the clubs that they're at. They don't get to interact in a way sometimes, they have social media handlers. So this happening is also the gatekeeper's biggest fear, is that the people will start communicating and the public will start connecting and mobilizing. This is one of the powers that be. It's our greatest fear, that we were so busy for so long being in our silos and working. But now that people are connecting and different movements are connecting, it's really wonderful to see, and how other movements have opened up their doors to other marginalized communities, be they racial or gender identity or whatnot, and say, no, this is not okay. We're not just doing anti-racism, we're doing anti-oppression, and that embodies everything. And that these athletes are doing it now is wonderful. And you look at the WNBA, for example, those women and Black queer women are often the center and the front of these type of mobilizations and movements. They had the blueprint.
Absolutely. And their protests, people certainly paid attention to them, didn't they? That it wasn't just on sports channels. News was talking about how they were threatening to shut down the season, and people took notice.
Yeah, and I mean, this isn't new for the WNBA. I mean, many years ago, the Minnesota Lynx were fined for wearing T-shirts that said, "I can't breathe." And they took the financial hits. They took the cultural within the culture of the WNBA. They took that sort of rebuking. And they did it anyway.
The other teams have now gone on board, and there will be no WNBA games tonight.
The Milwaukee Bucks sparked a basketball boycott and a chain reaction throughout the sports world.
I remember reading about Breanna Stewart, who was at a protest against the Muslim ban in 2017 after Trump was elected. And I remember thinking to myself, she's with a championship winning team in Seattle. She's not a Muslim woman. Why would she care? But she cared. And that moved me to pieces, because I was so touched by it. But that's the way that that movement works, with the understanding that it's going to be all of us and we're going to come at it. And to see this happening across the pond and this take shape. I mean, George Floyd's murder was a catalyst for so many things in different ways, and that affected those regions. So not to say that it's American or, global north centered, it was just that it had an effect in Europe. It most definitely did, because systems of racism certainly exist there, but it's manifesting for them the way that they need it to. With Marcus Rashford, it was through food for youth. It comes in different ways at different times. And so just to see these type of movements and see how people are sharing them globally and learning from each other is really important.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see how this has become personal for athletes, in the same way that for Marcus Rashford, he saw in those kids himself, right? That these kids who are not being fed, he knew what that felt like. We see WNBA players and NBA players as well seeing George Floyd and thinking, that could have been me. That could have been somebody that I know. And so something that is a big story becomes hyper-personal for athletes.
For the Burn It All Down podcast, I recently interviewed a WNBA player named Azrae Stevens, who used to play for UConn, and she plays for Chicago Sky now. And I asked her about the WNBA dedicating their season to Breonna Taylor. a victim of police brutality and murder. And, she said it, but it struck me so deeply. She said that it could have been her. And, when she was playing in Dallas, she lived alone in an apartment, and it could have been her. And she said it so simply, but it really, was just like, oh my goodness, that's how deep and that's how profound and personal this is. And we know this from the stories being shared, but just how scary that can be as well, and how people that don't experience that type of marginalization may not ever understand, which is why it's so important to listen to what these athletes are saying.
What kind of message do you think Marcus Rashford and other athletes like him who are using their platform, they understand the power of the position that they have to advance social change and social progress? What kind of message is that sending, not just to other athletes into the sports world, but what message is that sending to a wider society, you think?
Well, one of the effects I hope it has is that the people that are in charge of the money, I'm not trying to be cynical when I say this, but I do believe that change can only be enacted when people at the top are affected by that. So what affects them, like the decision makers, let's have you, or the owners, they're affected by money. So if Marcus Rashford is saying these things and saying that this is important to me and I'm an asset, I'm a clear asset at a national level, at a club level, he really is. And if what's happening here doesn't make me happy, I have agency. And he's quite young. He's only 23. And I think this is something that as you mature and as he gets good advice, and he's very grounded. I mean, he credits his mother with keeping him so centered. And I think that's really beautiful. Like, to have this kind of responsibility and attention at such a young age could be very overwhelming. And we know that in London and in England, rather, the paparazzi is not very kind and they don't offer a lot of grace to people they're chasing. So not just Marcus Rashford, but what society hopefully will pick up is one thing is that, yes, sports are inherently political, but also that you can do something in your grassroots community, which is how change is made. And signing a petition, giving $1 or £1 or whatever as a donation and paying attention to what's happening around you. And what you can do is mobilizing and encouraging people not to make huge necessary changes, because we know change comes incrementally. This is not a sprint. It's a marathon. And he's offering people ways and ideas in which to get involved, which is, for me, the most powerful thing.
Right. It almost brings home the humanity of the people who are on that field, that when we watch them on TV, they aren't just there to entertain us. They are people with lived experiences who have life experience of what it means to struggle.
Totally. I don't like the word humanizing because I take issue with that word. But in a way, the last 6 months have shown the pain and the grief that a lot of athletes are feeling. And that is affecting, hopefully, sports watchers to say, okay, no, he's not just a footballer. He's a person, and he's very clear with what his priorities are. And I think that's important too, because this idea that athletes are just to entertain us or just to perform for us and just to put a ball in the back of the net is unfair. And that's the way the system was created, to keep them like that. But they're pushing back and disrupting these systems, which I think is key.
It is a sea change. Shireen, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Adrian.
And that is Shireen Ahmed, writer and sports activist. I think we're both going to go back to supporting our own football clubs, but on this at least, something a bit bigger than who's leading in the standings. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.